I had to make sure to see if my hands was ashy a little bit, but I don't know if it would pick up in camera. But a part of me is like, they don't look moisturized, so they look ashy. I'll find out in prop and when I edit. And honestly, if my hands are ashy, I'm gonna just crop my hands out because you don't need to see them. Unless it's a moment where I can. Well, then I can add captions or maybe a sticker. My name is Nikale of Nikale Be Reading, the bookstagram that I created in I don't know when. I am the owner of Pour Into It Media, a media production company, and I am a creator of Project Deconstruction, which is the first web series produced by my media production company. So if you're new here, it's nice to meet you. Welcome. Thank you for checking this out. This has been a labor of love. I appreciate you taking the time to check this out. I hope you enjoy it. If you do, let me know. If you don't, also let me know. The only thing I ask is that you keep it kind and keep it respectful and practice empathy while you can. Parable of the Sower is one of my favorite novels. When I reflect on my deconstruction journey, this is the book that had the biggest impact on my deconstruction journey, and a part of that was because I saw myself so clearly in the main character, Lauren. When I read Parable of the Sower, so much about Lauren's life mimic my own, even if they look different. So when I think about her community of Robledo, it reminded me of the church that I grew up in. And while I have conflicting feelings about church, when it comes to the church and the community I grew up in, it had a very large impact on who I am today, in good ways and bad ways. When I look at Robledo, when I look at the church community that I grew up in, I'm incredibly grateful for the ways in which community has been shown to me. And while I have my challenges at church, when I think about Robledo, when I think about my church community, they are very pro small businesses, right? In Robledo, we see people within the community supporting other people, whether it's supporting with the Giannis's, they had their TV, whether it was people who had their acorn bread, whether it was people who played their roles within the community to serve the community as a whole, whether that's through volunteering on watch shifts, whether that's with the fire departments, whether that's with how people teach, whether it's with people coming together to do church things. And I think about my church community. And while I we'll talk about the homophobia there, and we'll talk about all of the things I've witnessed, all of the run-ins that I've had with a lot of men who abuse their positions of power in the church, it was one of the first places where I saw community, where I see people helping other people within the church, even if they weren't cool. I know people who drove to different states to support people within the church, even if they never met this person in the flesh. When I think about my electrician and someone within the church, when I think about the lawyer that I worked with when I closed on my home, it was someone within the church. When I think about real estate agents that people work with, it was people within the church. And I've had positive experiences working with people from the church that I used to go to. And so when I see a community like a Robledo, it feels very familiar to me. It reminds me of the church community that I grew up in. And while I may have those conflicting feelings in the same way I feel like Lauren experienced and shares her conflicting feelings, this is still home. This is still the community that you grew up in. And so when I read how Lauren navigates her community, what that looked like for her, that resonates with me because that feels familiar with me. And even layering in ways in which Robledo almost mimicked a lot of the social hierarchy that exists in churches, right? We still see there being some breakdown or responsibilities that are shared depending on the gender of the people within the church, right? When I read about how Lauren describes her father and his role, and her stepmom and her role. And we have her dad, this professor, this community leader, the pastor, very much seen as a leader within the community, right? When we read about how he would lead the pack or how he baptized people, we read about him with his guns, right? And then we layer in how we then hear Lauren describe her mom, right? As being a bit softer, a bit quieter. We see her being the one who is more emotive in a day-to-day, someone who is more tender, someone who babies their children, someone who has more of the household responsibilities. We see it mirror a lot of what many of us may experience in our homes growing up, and it mirrored the culture that I saw growing up in the church. Even when I think about her dad being a pastor and teaching from their living room, do you know How many basement preachers I know, people who started out their ministry teaching in their homes, teaching in their living rooms, teaching in their basements, having Bible studies with smaller, more intimate groups of people, and then it growing from there. So when I think about the role that Lauren's father played in her life, the position she saw him in, and the position and the role he played within the community, that feels very familiar to me. One of the things that I love in the earlier chapters, and this is in chapter 1 after we get past the dream that she was talking about, which I do think was very fascinating, because the novel opens up with the main character Lauren lucid dreaming, and in this dream she's teaching herself to fly, right? And I think about what that means and how that sets the tone for the rest of the novel as we see Lauren continue to grow and develop Earthseed, and where she then takes Earthseed through Parable of the Sower into Parable of the Talent, and then even seeing what the relationship with her and her daughter look like. But I'm going to pause there. Let me not get too ahead of myself, but you see how everything connects. One of the things that I love in the opening chapters of Parable of the Sower is we see Lauren start to give language around the belief of Earthseed. And we see her, when the novel opens up, very directly say, the God of my father is not my God. We see her talk about she got baptized in the name of gods that aren't hers, and she did it for her father. She did it out of guilt. She did it out of shame. She got baptized into a God that she don't believe in because she was a coward. And the novel opens up swinging. I don't know what other word to describe that, because just that line, I'm baptized into a God that is not my own. And I think about in the first season of Project Deconstruction, when I asked people how they ended up in church, when I asked people what their introduction to religion and Christianity looked like, it was always, not always, it was many people who talked about they didn't have the option on whether or not they wanted to go to church. And at my church, we did things differently because people weren't baptized until they were 20, until they made the active decision to do so, which I love. But I also think about how many people, how many children are baptized without their consent because it's what their parents wanted them to do. And so when I think about the novel opening up, especially understanding the drug that makes people enjoy fires, and it opens up with these children who are getting baptized into gods that they don't believe in. And one of the things that I love in the first chapter is that when it gets to her talking about the reasons on why people were getting baptized, it was as a sense of insurance, right? The sense of safety, as a, as a just in case I'm going to do this. Or how many people got baptized for reasons outside of themselves, like not having a choice, or because this is what their parents are doing. And when I initially read through the novel, I got it. I did get it. And also reading that when I left the church, it hits different. The earlier chapter is where we really learn a lot about Robledo, we learn a lot about Lauren, and we learn more about her family. She is the eldest. She has 4 brothers, all younger than her, and we see her talk openly about her relationship with her father, and she does talk about both parents to some extent. What I think is interesting, especially when I think about the social hierarchy that exists within the church, what is so fascinating to me is how the novel talks about her mother and talked about her father. We do not know her dad's name. I believe everyone else in the novel, we know their name, but we do not know her dad's name. It's dad, it's reverend, it's all of these things, but we know of his titles, right? We know that he's a professor. We know that he's a pastor. We know that he's a well-respected leader within the community. And when it comes to her mother, the only thing we know is that she abused substances when Lauren was born. That's all we know. Mother, the drug addict, and dad, this powerful leader, professor, provider for his family. And I think that is incredibly interesting. Not surprising, but incredibly interesting. And it's not surprising reflecting on how people speak about people with substance use issues. It's not surprising even thinking through the way some conservative, some church communities speak about women anyway. And I do think it's fascinating because we don't know their names. We just know them by, I feel like titles is a weird word, but that's the word that comes to mind. But also when I think about the mother, the drug addict, It certainly is. There are titles, but that dynamic is different. It's different. And when I say this is one of my favorite novels, like I'm one of them people, I annotate my books. I know people got strong feelings about that. Buki, if I paid for it, I'm gonna annotate it. I'm gonna write in it. I wanna read my notes. I wanna read my reflections. I wanna read the book over and then go back and be like, oh, this is what I was thinking at this time. I feel different, and leave little love notes to myself, like little thoughts, little reflections to my future self. It's a great way to live. You go be real upset at me because if you go through my books, you go see some pages that are dog-eared. And I know we have conflicting feelings about that, but you're gonna see it. You're gonna see it. You're gonna go through and you're gonna see my notes. And it's great because I'm not one of those people who let people borrow their books. But if I was, and if there's a friend that's close to me that for some reason wanted to borrow a book, please give it back. And I know I've kept y'all books. I know I have. I know this is a little hypocritical, double standard for me to say, because I have 2 books from my friends that are on my shelf comfortably. So I know I'm not the one to say it. I need my books back. I annotate my books. Y'all don't take note to y'all books. And I'm not saying that makes it right. I should return them. But y'all have come to my house and y'all have seen them on my shelf. So I feel like, honestly, y'all gave me the books. Give me my shit back. Please. Right? If you're following along, chapter 2, whatever page this is, I don't know. But it's the one from Sunday, July 21st, 2024. At least 3 years ago, my father's God stopped being my God. His church stopped being my church. And yet today, because I'm a coward, I let myself be initiated into that church. I let my father baptize me in all 3 names of that God who isn't mine anymore. My God has another name. Miss Butler, you're in your bag when you did this. I love it. Thank you. This character, I'm not going to hold you. I think Butler has some of the strongest female characters written that's going to do it for me every time. Every time. Moving on. Another thing that I think is very interesting is looking at Lauren's gift of hyperempathy. And I think about how her hyperempathy is regarded within the family and how that mirrors the way in which I've heard the church talk about mental health. Even when I reflect on things that her father would say on things along the lines of, you can beat this thing, right? There's something that isn't to be talked about, isn't to be discussed. This is a family thing. No one outside of this knows about this. And I do feel like there's this protective element there of people can use this against you. And also I think about how often the church minimizes mental health. Right? I think about how often I hear these comments when we're talking about individuals who are struggling with their mental health. You can beat this thing, right? Pray it away. And I think about how that then impacts people who genuinely do need help. And I feel like in the novel it's interesting because I feel like hyperempathy in this novel is something to be protected, kept secret, something that if someone else knew they could use against you. And also, hyperempathy is a bit of a superpower. So it's very interesting to read through this when it was looked at as something that was very much the opposite. And I think it's also just reflective of the time in which they were growing up in, because I guess there's not a lot of pleasure to feel. But I love when it comes to hyperempathy, like, yes, she bleeds with people. Yes, she feels the pain of other people. And also she feels all the good things. And yet this is still something almost to be ashamed of and protected in the novel. When I think about the framework that guides Project Deconstruction, this is a web series that was really born from my own deconstruction journey. And when I read about how directly Lauren criticized and questioned God, I found myself just thinking like, yes, this is something that I thought when I was in church. This is something that resonated with me. This is something that I feel on a personal level, right? And this line really guides the work that I do with Project Deconstruction. The idea of God is much in my mind these days. I've been paying attention to what other people believe, whether they believe, and if so, what kind of God they believe in. I love that, right? Because when I left the church, I found myself even before I left the church, I found myself incredibly interested in other people's relationship and view on God and what that looked like. And I was interested in hearing that perspective from all different people of different backgrounds, of different religious beliefs, people who were still in church, people who left the church, people who were ex-Mormons, people who were of the Baha'i faith, just people who, there were so many people and stories that I listened to because I found myself incredibly fascinated. Because what kind of God did you believe in? What did that look like for you growing up? What did that feel like for you growing up? How did that influence how you see yourself, how you see other people, and how you see the world? How did it influence your relationships? Like, that is incredibly fascinating for me, especially as someone who was a bit of a public health nerd, not even a bit, a pretty big public health nerd. That's my background. It's the work that I love doing. And so very often I'm thinking through how our environment shapes how we move through life and how we perceive life. And so when I read this, it really is a framework for my approach for Project Deconstruction. There are also moments throughout this novel where Lauren has very direct call outs, right? Take this one. A lot of people seem to believe in a big daddy God or big cop God or big king God. They believe in a kind of super person. A few believe God is another word for nature, and nature turns out to mean just about anything they happen to not understand or feel in control of. Some people say God is a spirit, a force, an ultimate reality. Ask 7 people what all of that means, and you'll get 7 different answers. So what is God? Just another name for whatever makes you feel special and protected? Quite beautiful. But let's keep it going because she eats with this whole page. There's a big early storm blowing itself out in the Gulf of Mexico. It's bounced around the Gulf, killing people from Florida to Texas and down to Mexico. There are over 700 known dead so far. One hurricane. How many people has it hurt? How many are going to starve later because of destroyed crops? That's nature. Is it God? Most of the dead are the street poor who have nowhere to go and who don't hear the warrant until it's too late for their feet to take them to safety. Where's safety for them anyway? Is it a sin against God to be poor? We're almost poor ourselves. There are fewer and fewer jobs among us, more of us being born. The kids are growing up with nothing to look forward to. One way or another, we'll all be poor someday. The adults say things will get better, but they never have. How will God, my Father's God, behave towards us when we're poor? If there's a God, if there is, does he, she, it care about us? Deists like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson believed God was something that made us, then left us on our own. Misguided, Dad said when I asked him about the deists. They should have had more faith in what their Bibles told them. I wonder if people on the Gulf Coast still have faith. People have had faith through horrible disasters before. And these are the questions that I had in church, right? What about other people? What about people who would never know God? No, what about people who would never have a Bible? What about people who don't read the KJV? What about all of these people? And it always, everyone has the opportunity. If people wanted to, they could. And it just didn't make sense, and it just didn't seem fair. And it became increasingly more difficult for me to believe that this is a kind God, this is a just God, this is a merciful God. And one of the things that I love, and early on when I say she got me, because even reading on past that chapter, she talks about the story of Job. And so when I read on, and Lauren Olamina captured this, and she said, my favorite book of the Bible is Job. I think it says more about my father's God in particular, and gods in general, than anything else I've ever read. In the book of Job, God says he made everything and he knows everything, so no one has a right to question what he does with any of it. Okay, that works. The Old Testament God doesn't violate the way things are now, but that God sounds a lot like Zeus, a super powerful man playing with his toys the way my youngest brothers play with toy soldiers. Bang, bang. 7 toys fall dead. If they're yours, you make the rules. Who cares about what the toys think? Wipe out a toys family, then give it a brand new family. Toy children, like Job's children, are interchangeable. Maybe God is a big kid playing with his toys. If he is, what difference does it make if 700 people get killed in a hurricane, or if 7 kids go to church and get dipped in a big tank of expensive water? What if it is all wrong? What if God is something else altogether? And literally one of the notes I have is Job is a wild-ass story. because it's a wild ass story. Now, one of the most interesting characters to me is Mrs. Sims. Mrs. Sims reminds me of those church mothers, the ones in church with the lap scarves. They got something to say to all the kids, even if they're not there. She reminds me of that type of character, the holier than thou, the real righteous character that always have something to say about what somebody else is doing. In the novel, Mrs. Sims committed suicide. She shot herself. And what was incredibly interesting to me, one, was how the novel talked about the relationship between her and her son. They did not like each other. They did not get along. Even though Mrs. Sims had space for them to move in, their relationship was so estranged that they refused to come live with her. And I thought that was incredibly interesting because now we're talking about parental estrangement, and we're talking about parental estrangement in this pandemic that's fucking the world up. And even then, they refuse not to interact or engage. One of the things that I think is incredibly fascinating is the moment in where Lauren was talking about Mrs. Sims and her belief, where if you have this belief, if you believe in this God so passionately the way that you did, then why do something like commit suicide? And I'll read it to you. I began writing this about Mrs. Sims because she killed herself. That's what upset me. She believed, like Dad, that if you kill yourself, you go to hell and burn forever. She believed in a literal acceptance of everything in the Bible, yet when things got to be too much for her, she decided to trade pain for eternal pain in the hereafter. How could she do that? Did she really believe in anything at all? Was it hypocrisy? Or maybe she just went crazy because her God was demanding too much of her. She was no Job. In real life, how many people are? I don't even have anything to say after that, so we can just go ahead and go. She continues to go in. God can't be resisted or stopped, but can be shaped and focused. This means God is not to be prayed to. Prayers only help the person doing the prayer, and then only if they strengthen and focus that person's resolve. If they're used that way, they can help us in our only real relationship with God. They help us to shape and to accept and work with the shapes that God imposes on us. God is power, and in the end, God prevails. But if we can rig the game in our own favor, if we understand that God exists to be shaped and will be shaped with or without our forethought, with or without our intent. That's what I know. That's some of it anyway. I'm not like Mrs. Sims. I'm not some kind of potential Job, long-suffering, stick-necked, and then at last either humble before an all-knowing Almighty or destroyed. My God doesn't love me or hate me or watch over me or know me at all, and I feel no love for or loyalty to my God. My God just is. Mic drop. What do you say after that? Like, Butler, this is really one of my favorite novels because the first 3 chapters start disrespectfully, and I love it. I feel seen. One of the things in the earlier chapters, we see their community navigate this election, and a lot of it was a bit prophetic on Butler's end when you think about the recent election that we had with when we think about the recent election. And one of the things that I talk about in this season of Project Deconstruction is voting and how people's view on civic duty may or may not have been shaped by the church. And so we get into some interesting conversation. And so as you watch this video, there'll be moments where I'll reference previous videos that I've done on Project Deconstruction or other conversations that were had on Project Deconstruction. And this season, season 2 of Project Deconstruction, does align with Octavia Butler's season and a lot of the themes that were written about in this novel. And this novel inspired not only the questions in this season of Project Deconstruction, but also new merch that is available on the websites. So check that out.